Good morning. So this week and next week, we're going to finish this little segment on how Greek ideas and Greek philosophy and so on intersected with the New Testament, how the New Testament authors responded, and so on. And then we'll move on to another topic. But today, the Logos. If you read the Gospel of John at the beginning, what does it say? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that the English translation word with a capital W that you typically find in your Bibles, that's one way to translate the Greek word logos. But there's a lot of richness to that word, a lot of meaning, a lot of background there that we need to look at. And to really understand what was John trying to say. Okay, come on. It's a Greek word that has a lot of common usages over the years. It can mean reason, or it's the root of our word logic. It can mean a message. It can mean meaning of something. It can mean a rule, and so on. But in philosophy, around 500 BC, it first began to use by a philosopher who gave it the name that he used for this idea that there was some impersonal force in the universe that could be called reason with a capital R, the order, the rationality to the universe, and so on. And that was one of the first philosophers who became part of the Stoic school. And so it became a Stoic concept, but then Plato's followers also picked it up. And then there were a group called the Hellenized Jews. Hellenic means Greek. The Jews who were greatly influenced by Greek thought, the Hellenized Jews, picked it up. Now, the Hellenistic Jews, primarily we're talking about a large community of Jews in Alexandria, Egypt. And these Jews began to use Greek because after Alexander the Great conquered the whole Mediterranean world and beyond in the 4th century BC, he died in 323 BC. So from that point on, that part of the world was Greek. And Greek became the common language. And even when the Roman Empire succeeded the Greeks, the Greek language was still the more commonly used language than Latin, right down to the time of the writing of the New Testament. And these Alexandrian Jews translated the Old Testament into Greek because they weren't really using Hebrew anymore. They were losing touch with their Hebrew. And so their everyday language was Greek, and they needed the Bible in Greek. And so that's where we get what's called the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And New Testament writers tended to use the Septuagint when they wanted to quote the Old Testament. Not always, but usually. So, but it wasn't just the language. They became influenced by Greek philosophy and by some ideas that weren't really all that compatible with biblical thought, Judaism. And so now you get this kind of strange mixture sometimes. One of the most prominent was Philo of Alexandria. And he in particular used this word logos a lot. Now, Philo lived from 25 BC to 50 AD, so his writings are influential at the time of the New Testament writings. He took that word logos, and instead of having it be an impersonal force, he personified it as some being who's created by God. Now, in Philo's teachings, which are kind of strange if you ever read them, he really emphasized the transcendence of God and how different God is from the material creation of God. The creator and the creation have a great distance between them, And he emphasized that. And as a result, he didn't believe that the material creation was evil, like the dualists that we studied, but he didn't believe that God would have direct contact with the material creation. So just like the dualists who relied upon the Creator creating some other being who could then do the material creation, and the original Creator doesn't get tainted by that evil material world, which is the unbiblical concept that we've looked at that led to Gnosticism and so on. He didn't believe the material world was evil, but he thought that for God to act in the world, he had to act through intermediaries of some sort. And out of all those intermediary beings, the most important was the one he called the Logos. So this was the message or the communication of God into the world in Philo's mind. So if you picture God up here, creation down here, Philo's concept, and a lot of Greek concept, he got it from the Greek system. There's got to be something in the middle. God can't be touching the creation directly. That God's got to be working through something in the middle, some intermediary. Now, sometimes he would identify the Logos with, say, Abraham. God's working his covenant through Abraham, or Moses, or angels, or whoever the current high priest is, would be the intermediary that God would work through. He wasn't consistent. He used the word Logos to mean the mind of God and the message of God and individual people. In his writings, he bounced around trying to figure it out. What about the Gospel of John now? As we mentioned in John chapter 1, it's typically translated the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The very beginning of the Gospel of John. Now, some scholars started claiming that John was just borrowing this idea from this semi-pagan idea, this pagan-influenced idea, that he was borrowing it maybe even directly from Philo of Alexandria, the Hellenistic Jew philosopher. But there are three explanations that are a lot better than that explain where John would get the idea. The first one is that there's this Greek word Sophia that means wisdom. And in the book of Proverbs, all of chapter 8, wisdom is personified. It's spoken of as a person almost created by God. I do this and I do that, speaking of wisdom. So perhaps John was in this Jewish tradition, which is also seen in Ecclesiasticus and Wisdom of Solomon, which are books in the Apocrypha. Maybe he was just following the Jewish tradition of personifying the way God works in the world. Just as wisdom was personified, maybe he was just doing that. So that would be a completely Jewish influence, no Greek philosophical influence that would explain what John was doing in John 1. And a similar example is that the phrase the Word of God or the Word of the Lord is spoken of in the Old Testament. Maybe that was his inspiration, because when that phrase is used, it personifies the way God acts in the world. And so take an example, Psalm 33:6, the heavens were made by the word of the Lord. That doesn't mean there's some separate being, but that's the way of speaking of the way God works in the world. It's an Old Testament way of speaking. And it can also be something negative like judgment. Isaiah 9:8, the Lord has sent a word against Jacob, and it will fall on Israel. So this could be an Old Testament pattern that John is following, the use of word in the Old Testament. But I personally think that the best explanation is that what John is trying to communicate here is that Jesus Christ, the Logos that he refers to in chapter 1, is superior to all of these intermediary conceptions in Greek philosophy and Hellenistic Jewish philosophy. It's superior. Everyone's looking for some intermediary between God and man. Jesus is the intermediary between God and man, and he's superior to all of these Greek and Hellenistic Jewish conceptions. So those first two explanations make it sound like it's kind of a coincidence that John used this word that was also used in Greek philosophy and Greek-influenced Jewish philosophy. But I don't think it was a coincidence. I think he was consciously refuting it. He was consciously providing something superior. So we start the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos. Well, what does that mean? The Logos is eternal. It was in the beginning. All of the other conceptions of some intermediary being start out with a creator who's eternal, and then he creates some intermediaries. That means they're not eternal, right? They're created. John is saying something very important here to our doctrine of Jesus Christ, our Christology. Jesus Christ is eternal. Doesn't have the name Jesus until he's incarnate. But the Christ, the Son of God, is eternal. He's there in the beginning with the Father. And all of these other Logos conceptions from Greek thought are not that way at all. Not Moses, not high priest, not Abraham, not Greek philosophical ideas. None of them were eternal. And he continues, and the Word was with God. With means participating with. All, as he goes on to say in chapter 1, everything that's created is created through Christ. The Son is part of the creation effort, not just the Father. They're equal. They work together. The Son and the Father did everything together. Everything they accomplished through the world, they accomplished together. The Son was not just some intermediary through whom the Father accomplished things. He was with God. Now that's unlike any of these Greek ideas or these Jewish ideas. And finally, the conclusion of verse 1, and the Word was God. The Logos was God. So not only is the Logos eternal, not only is the Logos fully participating with God equally in all of the Father's works, but the Logos is the same. It's the same being. It's the doctrine of the Trinity. There's three persons that you can speak of, but they are only one being. They're not separate deities. Now, so this is a statement, of course, that really cannot apply to anything in the Greek conception that led to the use of the word Logos, even among the Jews. This is the doctrine of the Trinity. These are the persons who are eternal together, do everything, every work together, and are equal, the Father and the Son. Now, this has to do with the original, what's the original concept of Logos? We perceive, we feel the gulf, the distance between ourselves and God, right? He doesn't physically manifest himself and overwhelm us with something visual or whatever. There's always a human problem that we are distant from God in some respect. We always want to be closer to God and less distant from God. And all of these other philosophies and religions try to invent something to bridge that gap between us and God. In Greek mythology, for example, you can kind of see psychologically the approach is drag the gods down to our level. The Greek gods and goddesses are just like people, except they have more power. And that's kind of scary, because their conception is not that the gods and goddesses are all that good or noble. They're just powerful. And you don't want beings who aren't all that good to have that much power. Many of the pagan religions and mythologies pictured gods as these powerful beings that you'd better appease because they have the same, temper tantrums as human beings and so on. They have the same characteristics as human beings. And that would be pretty terrifying, right? So I'm reminded of a Twilight Zone episode where the little boy somehow acquired the power to, whatever he pictured, he could make it happen, and he could, vaporize people if he got mad at you. Now you've got this problem. You've got some powerful being who's not good. It's scary. If his mood goes the wrong way, then you're in trouble. Well, if the Greek gods and goddesses' mood went the wrong way, you're in trouble. But psychologically, I think it fulfilled a need. Instead of having this big gulf between themselves and their gods, there wasn't really that big a gulf, except in power. And then in Eastern religions, in religions from India, for example, there's this concept of you over time ascending out of your human state and becoming godlike and merging back into the soul of God or whatever. So the gap is bridged in a totally opposite way. But see, God understands human nature. He created us. He knows what our needs are. God knows that we will feel distant from him because of not seeing him and being overwhelmed by his presence all the time. And God came up with a solution. God said, I will bridge the gap between myself and human beings by having my Son, having the Son of God, one of the persons of the Trinity, become incarnate as a human being with a body and be visible and teach so that you can see him and hear him and so on. Now think about what that means to us. If you only had the Father, if you had no New Testament, and if you only conceived of God in the Old Testament, what would you picture in your mind? You picture something, but you're not picturing something accurate, right? We know that when we picture the big man with the white beard in the sky or whatever, we know that's not some accurate depiction of God. But when I picture Jesus Christ as a man in the first century walking around the promised land and teaching and so on, it's an accurate picture. God gave us that. God put us in touch with him through Jesus Christ. God said, you can't bridge the gap between you and me, but I can help you. I can bridge the gap. I can reach out to you. Just as we can't reconcile ourselves to God, he has to do it through grace. We can't bridge the gap between ourselves and God, but he can bridge the gap. And that's what he did through Jesus Christ, through the incarnation, was he reached out to us. He gave us something we can picture. He gave us himself in a way that we can be in touch with. But in all these pagan philosophies and religions, people are floundering around trying to close that gap, either by men becoming godlike or by gods being dragged down to our level, or by some intermediary beings that are kind of getting us to bridge that gap. These are all just human efforts to accomplish what God accomplished in a far superior way through Jesus Christ. And John is speaking of the superiority of Jesus Christ, I believe, to all other conceptions of the Logos. How does God work in the world? What's his message to the world? What intermediaries does he have? All of these things to which the word logos was attached. John's saying, are you looking for something like that? Well, here's something better. Here's the superior logos. Here's what God has provided as the logos. Here's the go-between. Here's the message of God. Here's the action of God in the world. Jesus Christ, Son of God incarnate. That's the logos. And so John wasn't influenced by pagan philosophy. He was answering it. He was saying, you're looking in the wrong place. God has already taken care of this. And that's something that we can celebrate, not just on Easter Sunday, but every day of our lives. God reached out to us. God understands that we have a problem of feeling distant from him. And so his Son was incarnate as a man, and we can relate to him, we can picture him, we can feel connected to him, and therefore connected to God. Whereas without him, I would just continue to feel that God is some being I can't picture that it's hard for me to be close to. So this is one of the miracles, of what God has done. It shows the wisdom of God, that he knows us and what we need. And John is expressing that beautifully in the first chapter. Now, the word logos doesn't appear in the book of Hebrews. But next week we'll wrap this up by looking at how the book of Hebrews seems to be answering this particular problem also. Who were the Hebrews to which it was written? I think we'll see it's those Hellenistic Jews. It's those Alexandrian Jews. And the book of Hebrews is often interpreted as the superiority of Christ to Old Testament covenant, superiority of the new covenant. But I believe, once you understand this, it's the superiority of Christ to all of those intermediaries, angels, Moses, high priest. That's the structure of the book of Hebrews. It's the Alexandrian Hebrews, I believe, that it was being written to. We'll take a look at that next week. Thank you. Hey,